Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
Back in 2005, while researching an article in the US Memory Championships, Josh became intrigued by the potential of his own memory. And in Moonwalking with Einstein, the book that he's promoting tonight, is a story of what happened next. So Joshua, what did happen next?
What happened next is I became obsessed. I was fascinated by this, first of all, by the mere fact that there was an event that existed called the United States Memory Championship, which I discovered the way I discover all good things, which is through Google. Right. And I showed up at this contest to cover it as a science journalist. And I guess expected that it was going to be all of these savants, people with photographic memory, freaks of nature of some kind. And it turned out that wasn't the case. The people who competed in this contest, who memorized, I mean, just unbelievable things, hundreds of random numbers, entire poems, the names of dozens and dozens, hundreds of strangers, turned out they all professed to have just average memories and claimed that they had trained themselves to perform these rather astonishing feats. And I was hooked from the minute I met them.
Right. And you were not just hooked, you were actually researching it in some context, right? So you got to know them almost from the outside, trying to understand that world as an outsider, and you gradually became an insider.
Yes, I mean, so the story goes I was actually standing outside the competition hall and met a British fellow named Ed Cook, who had one of the best trained memories in England, and he was over as a kind of spring training for the World Championships, which were later that summer, and he said to me, "Oh, well, you're a journalist. Do you know Britney Spears? Because I really want to teach Britney Spears how to memorize a deck of playing cards on US television. It'll prove to the world that anybody can do this." I was like, well, maybe you could teach me. I mean, you got to start somewhere. And that's how this whole journey began.
And Ed features quite heavily in the book. He became almost like a mentor, coach kind of person. Give us some idea of the sort of things he taught you along the way.
So it turns out, once upon a time, the idea of a cultivated, disciplined memory, of laboriously furnishing one's memory, was not nearly so alien as it is today. And there were a host of techniques that were once widely known and widely practiced for remembering stuff. And those techniques formed the basis of what I ended up entering into, which was a kind of training of my own memory, and also an investigation of it, to try and understand how it works, why it sometimes doesn't work, and what its potential might be.
And before you began this, you said your own memory was nothing special. It was just, you even did a test beforehand to sort of see where you were, a kind of baseline measurement.
Yeah, I tried to be like properly scientific about this, so I hooked up with a scientist at Florida State University and went and had my memory tested, see what my baseline abilities were. And basically, my baseline abilities were pretty average.
We typically think of expertise as being a sort of 10-year, 10,000 hours kind of phenomenon, but within a year, it seems, you went from average normal to supernormal.
Right. So, okay, there are a couple things to say. First is that there is an old distinction that goes back to the earliest treatises on memory written in classical Latin between what's known as natural memory and artificial memory. So natural memory is the memory you're born with, the basic hardware. Artificial memory is what you're able to do with that natural memory through training, through techniques, through structuring information. And that's what I was training. Now, I ended up having really two secret weapons. And the first was that my coach was a Brit. And this entire sport of competitive memorizing is driven by a kind of arms race, where every year somebody comes up with a new way of remembering more stuff more quickly, and then the rest of the field has to play catch up, and it is almost always somebody in Europe. The entire art of what's going on in these competitions and in the general idea of remembering better is what's known to psychologists as elaborative encoding, depth of encoding. It is to transform information that is unmemorable into information in some form that is so weird, beautiful, ugly, bizarre, gory, raunchy, lewd, stinky, emotionally resonant that you just can't forget it. That's the essence of what's going on. It turns out one of the things our brains are wired to remember, and I'm sure you guys can all come up with hypotheses for why this would be the case, are things that are raunchy. Choose your Victoria's Secret lingerie model of choice, walking down the street doing something really obscene, you would remember it. And similarly, if you can conjure that image in your mind's eye, you will remember it. And that's actually the art of what's going on in these contests.
And more generally, you could develop on this idea of how one does it. You're saying that we've evolved to be very good at spatial imagery, very good at navigating spaces, such that we can remember images of a house and where things are located very well. But we're very bad at things like text and numbers and things that we have relatively recent need for. And basically, it's about transferring text and numbers into vivid spatial imagery. Is that about right?
Yeah, and I mean, if you think about it, it makes a certain amount of sense. Our ancestors, who by and large made their living as hunter-gatherers, it was really important for them to remember the route home, where the resources were, where the saber-toothed tiger was hanging out. What they didn't need to know was phone numbers and the names of a dozen people at cocktail parties because they lived in relatively small, stable groups. So like other aspects of our body and our mind, our memories evolved in an environment that is different from the environment in which we use them today. And so part of what's going on in these contests and in the idea of remembering better is transforming the sorts of memories that our minds weren't built for into the kinds of memories that we are well adapted for. One of the techniques that Ed taught me goes back 2,500 years to ancient Greece, is known as the memory palace. And this was a technique that was supposedly invented by the Greek poet Simonides in the 5th century BC. And the notion is to do what you were saying, use your spatial memory to store information that you actually want to recall. The story goes, Simonides was attending a banquet. He steps outside, and the moment he crosses the threshold, the banquet hall collapses, kills everybody inside. Not only that, mangles all of the bodies beyond all recognition, such that nobody can say who was inside, who was sitting where, nobody can be properly buried. It's one tragedy compounding another. And Simonides closes his eyes and has this realization that he's able to see in his mind's eye where each of the guests at the banquet were sitting. And from that realization sprung this technique known as the memory palace. And the idea is, we're really good at this kind of spatial memory. So what if instead of remembering the guests at the banquet hall, you instead remember, I don't know, the words of a poem or something you actually care to remember.
Okay. And you translate one into the other somehow.
Right.
So this that's the bit that I think people would find quite difficult. How does one go about translating a poem into vivid imagery such that it stays in your memory?
Well, the idea would be to essentially visualize, engage as many of your senses as you possibly can in visualizing imagery that represents whatever it is you want to remember. That's the essence of the art. And what these people who compete in these contests are able to do is do it very, very, very quickly. It sounds counterintuitive, but what's going on in these contests is actually a kind of creative act. It's an act of engaging the imagination, and it's really fun. That was the thing that rather shocked me. I don't think I would have gotten interested in this subject if it weren't really fun to do.
Right. And I mean, the guy, what's interesting about the strategy Ed suggested for you is it was almost entirely based on Greek and Latin books. Like he sort of said, don't read any of that popular self-help, how to improve your memory stuff. Go back to the Greeks and the Latin writers because they knew their stuff.
This is the really shocking thing. 1,000 years ago, the people who were writing medieval treatises on memory, or 2,000 years ago, the classical Latin writings on memory, these people understood stuff about cognitive psychology that we only rediscovered in the 20th century. And they didn't just know it, they were applying it in their lives. And they obviously didn't have the terminology that we have today, but there's so much that they had figured out that we had to rediscover.
From the moment you knew nothing, you were a journalist trying to find out about a subculture. Mm-hmm. Tell us how that developed in the next 12 months towards suddenly winning the US Memory Championship.
I was a recent college grad. I was trying to cut my teeth as a freelance journalist. This was something that was going on kind of at the periphery of my vision. this memory training. I was writing articles about memory. And, you know, between waking up, having my cup of coffee, and sitting down to read the New York Times, I would try and spend a good 20 to 30 minutes learning a poem. I bought some old yearbooks from a flea market and would try and remember people's names. So I learned a few things along the way. And that was the essence of my training, and doing this over and over again, and learning how to get better at it. And there's an entire field of psychology that is devoted to understanding how people get to be really good at what they do. And I dove into that literature, and I spent a lot of time talking to scientists, to psychologists who study expertise, who study skill acquisition, to try and figure out if there were ways that I could improve at what I was trying to improve at as efficiently and effectively as possible, and that gave me a real advantage.
To become an expert, you know, physician, or an expert chess player, or you know, expert linguist even, you're speaking about, you know, 10 years typically. I mean, technology speeds it up a little bit, but we still think about 10,000 hours before someone goes from novice to expert. Mm-hmm. And yet, in your case, it sounds like you went from novice to expert in 1 year. So what I inferred from that is perhaps we're all latently more expert than we think, and that part of the story here is that the memories, we're all to some extent memory experts, and we don't even know it yet.
I do think that's true, that we are all memory experts and don't even know it. The things that we are passionate about, we tend to develop terrific memories for, and this is not a coincidence. In fact, it's a subject that's been studied from a gazillion different angles.
The conventional wisdom, of course, is that memory is a great thing, it helps you in life, it helps you adapt. But it's also a form of baggage. It's also a form of suffering sometimes. And it often prevents us from really being in the present. A lot of our everyday mentality is drifting to images of the past. So what would you say to that? Is memory always a good thing, or are there times when it's actually a sort of handicap?
Well, I spent time with an individual who's known in the medical literature as EP. And I went and visited EP out in his home in San Diego, where he lived with his wife. You could talk to EP for several minutes before you realize there was something deeply and profoundly wrong with him. In 1992, this freakish virus attacked his brain, essentially cored it like an apple, knocked out his hippocampal regions, which are the part of the brain that transform our perceptions into long-term memories. And without these brain regions, he not only had lost everything that had happened to him since about 1950, he also was completely unable to form new memories. And one of the things that was kind of shocking about talking with him, because he was surprisingly content. He was like this perfect pathological Buddha who lived completely and entirely in the present, hovering between this past that he couldn't remember and this future that he simply couldn't contemplate. And that was striking to me. I mean, here was a guy who would have breakfast 3 times every morning because he couldn't remember that he had had breakfast. And yet, he moved through life never being particularly agitated and never being particularly sad. But at the same time, he couldn't provide even the most basic psychological, emotional sustenance to the people he loved and who loved him. I mean, to be a person, you have to exist in the dimension of time and be able to register the changes in other people and the changes in yourself, and he just couldn't do that. S is also another famous case from the literature. S had a vacuum cleaner memory. He just remembered way too much. And he was a journalist. So I was kind of attracted to his story, being a journalist myself. This guy didn't need to take notes. He just remembered everything. The problem was, being a journalist is more than just taking in all that information, it's also filtering it. And this was what he simply couldn't do. He couldn't make that distinction between the things that were worth remembering and the things that weren't worth remembering. And as a result, he was a failure as a journalist. He couldn't make a living doing anything besides basically performing stage tricks. There's a short story by Borges called Funes the Memorious, which is about a character who's shockingly similar to S. Apparently Borges didn't know S, and S didn't know Borges. And Borges concludes the story that, you know, thinking, the essence of being human, is not remembering, but forgetting.
If it's true that we can very quickly improve our memories for basic facts and figures, people's names, etc., what follows for education? What follows for our own lives? What kind of things would you have people do differently because of what you've learned?
The thing that I took away from all of this at the deepest level was something a bit simpler, which is the general principles behind why this stuff works and the importance of having those in the front of your mind, which are, first of all, the importance of paying attention, to try and move through the world reminding myself that, like, look, you know, when I throw down my keys and I don't remember where I put them, that's because I wasn't paying attention, and that's fine. But you don't want to be the kind of person who moves through the world treating everything like you've just thrown down your keys. That's a recipe for a forgetful life. And you have to tell yourself, I'm going to be the kind of person who remembers to remember. That's something you have to have in the front of your head. The second thing is, what makes things memorable is that they are meaningful, that they are significant, that they are potentially colorful to you in some way, and trying to figure out in this, whatever this piece of information that I'm trying to learn, whatever this experience that I want to remember, what are the factors here that are going to make it significant, meaningful, important, potentially colorful. And that may sound slightly vague and like, but I actually think those are really helpful things to move through the world with in the front of your mind.